I think to understand the 60s, you have to understand the racial situation in the country at that time. In the South, you know, at that time, or some 10 years earlier, at that time, you had racial segregation. I know, as Rick indicated, it's hard to believe. But when we were kids in the South, it was in the newspapers every day, this is white only, this is black only. In Alabama and Mississippi, you had black people sitting at the back of the buses. You had kids getting absolutely inferior educations. You had vestiges of slavery. And I remember on a personal level, the idea, now one sees a black and white couple, you know, a guy or a woman, no one really blinks much of an eye now. But in that time, even in cities like New York City, which had, you know, certainly large multiracial populations, it was an astounding sight to see a black and white person holding hands. People really couldn't believe it. It was really just absolutely startling, hard to believe. And for me, one of the important things about the 60s and being in Chicago was the first opportunity that I had in my life to work with black people and to understand and work together. And I think one of the things that I saw being at the University of Chicago, which was and is, you know, certainly a very highly regarded university, much higher, say, on the level of supposedly good universities than UVM, is the basic hypocrisy of most of what was going on. I can say without blinking an eye that I learned infinitely more in the streets and in the community than I did in the classrooms. The classrooms were extremely boring. And I remember one incident that comes out in my mind. It strikes me. I'll never forget it. We were involved in the real world, in dealing with civil rights and so forth. And at that time, and became later very apparent, and I'm sure Rick and I will get into this later, in 1968, as some of you may recall if you read history, and it's in that anthology that you have, there was the Democrats held their convention in 1968 and elected Hubert Humphrey for president. They were rioting in the streets and so forth and so on. And the Chicago police were exposed at that point as being extremely brutal. Well, I learned that actually some years before. There were demonstrations, and I remember dealing with segregated schools. The schools in Chicago were segregated. The neighborhoods were very rigidly segregated. And there were demonstrations, blacks and whites working together. And I will never forget, there was a picture in the Chicago Defender, which was, and I suspect still is, a black newspaper of Chicago. And there was a photograph on the front page of a white policeman twisting the arm of a young black girl behind the back. It was a very effective photograph, and somebody had cut this out, put it on a poster. We were holding a meeting to protest police brutality in Chicago. And I remember walking down 57th Street in Chicago, walking away and tacking up these posters, come to a meeting, protest police brutality, and I'm walking down the street, protest police brutality, put it up. Little did I know there's a police car following me down the street. The cops have taken down the posters, taken down the posters. Finally, I come to the corner. The guy says, "Are these your posters?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "You know, the problem with the city is outside agitators like yourself. You know, if you people weren't doing this, the city would be, you know, da-da-da." I was very frightened, needless to say, very frightened. And then I had to leave because I had to race upstairs to go to my political science class. And I sat in the back of the room there thinking about the tremendous, the lack of reality, here I had just dealt with something that was very real. I was out on the street dealing with the policemen about a situation regarding racial segregation that was taking place 3 blocks from where this class was going. And the teachers talking away, and it was like a million miles away. You know, we'd raise a hand, some of us would care, well, what about what's going on now? And the answers you'd get, they'd bore you. And you say, this is what's going on outside my window, and this is what's going on inside the classroom. And by and large, that was true with very few exceptions. And now I'm talking about what was then and probably is today one of the better universities in America. There were a few teachers who had openness and compassion. I remember a fellow who had left Nazi Germany, a very, very decent guy. But by and large, most of what we were hearing in class was not relevant to what we were feeling and seeing out on the streets and out in reality. And I could say without the slightest doubt, I learned far, far more outside of the streets. Now, also what happened is the university and I had a difference of opinion, not a difference of opinion, regarding my academics. I was not doing very well, and the dean suggested that maybe I take a little bit of time off to think about whether or not I was going to continue going to the school. So I sat down, and it was amazing. What I ended up doing is I guess I was out for a semester, and I buried myself. I was working, but I buried myself down in the basement of the library. They had a very, very fine library, which probably dubbed as a bomb shelter. Speaking of bomb shelters, a massive building, and it goes miles down into the you have to fight your way into the stacks. They weren't open. You had to sneak in. It's remarked to sneak in to read books. It was at a university, but you know, slip in and then you'd bury yourself down there for days. And I would do an enormous amount of reading.